We have on the line with us here on the Final Say Radio Show, Dr. Walid Phares, who is an advisor to the Anti-Terrorism Caucus of the U.S. House of Representatives and Co-Secretary General of the Transatlantic Legislative Group on Counterterrorism. He is also, and it's in my hands because I'm a proud owner of it, The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East, and has served as Senior Advisor on Foreign Policy and National Security to presidential candidate Mitt Romney. We're going to be having a very interesting discussion on affairs going on in the Middle East and the specific hotspots of Egypt, Syria, Israel, Gaza, West Bank, and possibly some other nations. Dr. Walid Phares, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be on your show.
Well, I have to say, just from the get-go, that your book was extremely well-timed, and so right on the money. And in fact, I really wish that a lot of the advisors and people in the security apparatus in this nation have been listening to you at, well, the things that you've been covering and discussing for so many years much sooner, because you've been on the money.
Well, I certainly hope so. Glad that viewers, listeners in my media interaction interviews and my readers mostly have enjoyed the book. I was surprised actually by the fact that the book was more accurate than my own prediction before that, in a sense that we published The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East in the summer of 2010. Actually, it was on print in October. And by January, as we all know, these revolts spread out throughout Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Syria, and beyond. But what I think is more important is not just that the revolts were predicted, it's that the civil wars that followed these revolts, particularly as we see in Syria, very serious, bloody civil war. In Egypt, it's a quasi-civil conflict. It's not yet armed, but there's great disturbances. And the third projection is the fact that after the fall of dictators, as was the case in Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and Yemen, there has been and will continue to see a race between two global forces, the Islamists, who won the first round in the so-called Arab Spring, followed by the secularists, the youth, civil society, women. And it is my projection now, we can talk about that the next opposition, the next real Arab Spring, is brewing right now, as we see, for example, in Egypt or in Tunisia.
No, that's very interesting. So as we're seeing, well, just the last few years of occurrences and the changes in various regimes and uprisings and whatnot within these various countries, and you've so very carefully pointed out the difference. In Syria, you've had roughly over 70 or nearly 70,000 people who have been killed in the civil war, and you haven't seen that in Egypt. You've seen a different type of change, but there is always that possibility. But if you're advising the U.S. policymakers right now, what are the key things that you would be telling them to address, and which are the key spots that you would start with?
Well, unfortunately, as you know, and you mentioned that, we had a platform prepared for the other campaign, the other alternative administration, but we lost, of course, in November. But nevertheless, I do advise members of both parties in Congress. And of course, as you mentioned, if I'm in a position to advise the administration or Washington as a whole, well, first of all, the problem is that we are 2 years late to whatever advice or policy recommendation we're going to give. So you're going to take this into consideration. So when you ask an analyst to project and to provide an advice, it depends when you ask that, for that advice. In 2011, we were in a much better position. Let me give you an example. The most dramatic situation is in Syria. Why is it more difficult for the Obama administration today, or any U.S. administration today, to confront the situation in Syria? Because of geopolitics. In 2011, we were still present in Iraq. And that was very important because if you look at the map, you'll see that Iraq was a wall that separated Iran from its strategic ally Assad in Syria. So if in 2011 we would have taken enough action, it doesn't have to be through the United Nations. If we failed at the United Nations, we were to the east of Assad, to the south of him in Jordan, to the north of him in Turkey, and Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. action would have been much more possible to crumble this regime. Now that we left Iraq, the real problem that we have is this. The Iranian regime has penetrated Iraq, and we have reports about that. They're using Iraqi airspace, Iraqi land to connect with the Assad regime in Damascus and supply Assad regime with everything it needs, which is presenting Washington with a challenge. If we want to take action in Syria, as we did in Libya, let's suppose this is an option, the reaction will come not just from the Assad regime, but from 4 regimes, from Iran, from the Iraqi pro-Iranian government, from Hezbollah in Lebanon. So time has always been very important. Now, it's going to take a way different strategy to handle the issue of Assad regime. And as I wrote yesterday, we've got to be ready for an Iranian reaction if we want to put serious pressure on Assad. So now we have a choice. Either we're going to have a reshaping of our strategy across the region to put real pressure on Iran so we can get results in Syria. That's one option. The other option is to negotiate with the Russians. In Egypt, quickly, we have a different situation. We had an opportunity in 2011 to engage with, partner with the youth, the actual first wave of the spring that took Tahrir Square. But we waited too long, and unfortunately, I must to say, as I argued in articles, not in the book though, that we partnered with the wrong people. We partnered with the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood seems to be establishing in Egypt or re-establishing another form of authoritarian regime. So these are 2 examples. Of course, there are many other examples, but these are 2 examples how we failed in 2011, and of course in 2012 we had presidential elections, so no real action was taken. So now in 2013, we are faced with a much more difficult situation than we had 2 years ago.
Now, I saw an article that you had posted in social media referring to the fact that a lot of the minority groups, such as the youth groups and Coptic Christians and women's organizations, have been kind of unifying together, if I don't have that mistaken, to try to deal with the rising Muslim Brotherhood and some of the Islamic factions.
Absolutely. What's happening right now is that most components of civil society in Egypt who realized that they have been outmaneuvered by the Brotherhood at the end of 11 and throughout 12, that's number one, who have realized that the military are not in a position anymore to contain the Brotherhood, and who realized, number 3, unfortunately, that Washington sort of sided, if not officially, but at least certainly unofficially, with the Brotherhood. So what they're trying to do now is just counting on themselves. Therefore, you saw that in the media now, we see that the Copts are unifying their churches. They have never done that before. That women's organizations, youth organizations, middle class, labor union, and farmers, this is something new in Egypt, are coming together, and we saw it as of last December, into massive demonstrations to tell Mr. Morsi that he is not going to be, having an easy ride establishing another authoritarian regime. But again, they are pretty much isolated, the Egyptians. They're on their own, and that's why I do recommend that Washington and Brussels, European capital, open up with these forces of civil society.
Dr. Phares, this is a really difficult challenge to some degree. I look at the Muslim Brotherhood, it appears clearly one because they had the organizational prowess that nobody else had. I mean, that was a fairly easy one to predict during the early days of the Arab Spring. Now it seems that having neutered a lot of the military leadership, they have the muscle to stay in power. So the question I have for you is, are there enough secular Egyptians who hope for a Western-style democracy to counter the Muslim Brotherhood's desire for a theocratic regime? And if so, is there sort of a tipping point? Like, is there a certain time or some other event in your mind that, as you said, the European Union and the Americans have to get behind so we can have, let's say, a second spring and maybe get this under control before we hit a point of no return?
That is the greatest question. That's a strategic question. That is what I deal with when I brief members of Congress, both sides. It's what can we do now at this point in time, knowing that the Brotherhood have basically the largest organized network in Egypt, no doubt about that. They were number 3 after the armed forces, after the ruling party of Mubarak, and now they are probably number 1 or equal to the armed forces who have been sort of sidelined politically. But let me go back to the early days of the revolt. That's very important, and there is a point to be clarified to your audience, to the public. It is true that as Mubarak was falling, the next most powerful network was a combination of Brotherhood and Salafist, the Islamist network. But it's also true that civil society has mustered more people on the ground. If you look at the early days of Tahrir, there was this huge mass of people, and you look at their signs were not very professional. You had women, you had minorities, and then slowly but surely the Brotherhood moved in to the center of Tahrir Square, much more organized, and they took advantage of two things. And that is something we need to take into consideration. Number one, they took advantage of a very powerful support by Al Jazeera, so air support. They had air superiority, if you want to call it that way, in Egypt, that the opposition didn't have any network to support them. They got the support of petrodollars directly from the Gulf, including from Qatar. But they got something else. They got an indirect maneuver by Washington, let me say clearly, the administration, that put pressure on the military to accept the Brotherhood rights. See, without this, the Brotherhood may have not had a free hand, a free rolling into government and into parliament. And we got that information from the opposition and from the military, because an alliance between the secular and the military would have contained the Brotherhood, and fairer elections would have happened. But what happened is that the Brotherhood, and let me finish quickly here, used the youth to march against Mubarak, then used the youth to put pressure on the military, then partnered with the military during the transition to put pressure on the youth. And when elections were held, the Brotherhood became the most powerful organization. So having said that, I would say that the Brotherhood has a very large network. The collection and federation of small NGOs by the youth and women and political parties can muster something equivalent to the Brotherhood. The problem is that they don't have the funding. They don't have the equivalent of the petrodollars on the one hand. I wish Euro money from Europe will go to their NGOs. I wish we would earmark half of the $1.8 billion that we send to Egypt to civil society. That would strengthen the civil society. But it needs a political decision in Washington that we don't have at this point in time.
Excellent answer. I have another be actually my final question. So Egypt and Iran are toying with what appears to be their own version of détente and have been for some time since the Muslim Brotherhood took over. And that's extended itself to competing influence over Hamas in Gaza. And so it feels to me like we have this really difficult question of U.S. military aid possibly being a no-win situation, right? If we pull it back, we undermine the peace treaty and give the MB a reason to break the treaty with Israel. However, providing the aid gives somewhat of a tacit approval to the MB's policies. So the tough question for you what would a Secretary of State Walid Phares do? Is there a reasonable, easy answer to what to do with military aid at this point?
Look, I suppose Phares, Secretary of State or Deputy Secretary of State or what have you, or an advisor, would first of all be part of a cabinet, of an administration that has a plan. No single one person could really provoke only with ideas a significant change. So even if I have the best ideas, if you don't have a cabinet, an administration backed by a Congress knowing exactly what the problem is and moving on all levels. What I mean by all levels, first of all, we need to have a transatlantic coalition, solid coalition, because with the Europeans and with the extended Europeans, we could do a much more achievement in North Africa and the Middle East. Look at the French going by themselves to Mali, and we are withdrawing from Afghanistan. There is a little bit of chaos out there. So number one, solidify the alliance with the Europeans, have a joint plan for North Africa and the rest. Second, reach out to forces in the region that are very nervous. And your question was excellent because it put it in perspective between Iran and the Brotherhood. These are the two players now. But in between, you have forces in the Middle East that are very nervous. And I'm not talking about Israel. I'm talking about the Gulf. I'm talking about Jordan. I'm talking about many other forces in the region who feel that they are going to be smashed between those two forces. So reach out to these. Thirdly, with regard military aid that we send to Egypt, what we need to understand is that the Egypt of today is not the Egypt to which we used to send, the $1.8 billion and we opened our military material to them because there was a Mubarak. Now there is a Morsi. the leader who can give orders to those military today, is not the head of the military. It's now Morsi who's making inroads inside the military. So that leaves me with the following. First of all, we need to have a multi-pronged approach. One, with the allies, the additional allies in the region. Second, inside Egypt, we've got to reach out to civil society. When Egyptians are demonstrating, they're putting a lot of pressure on Morsi. When that is happening, then we'll be talking with the military at the same time. We create double pressure on Morsi. We call for legislative elections that are coming in April. With regard to the military aid by itself, let me share with you what unofficially some of the military in Egypt are telling us. They don't need those F-16. They need us to put pressure on Morsi to let go of his pressure on the military. So we are actually being maneuvered by the propaganda machine of the Brotherhood that is telling us through their various ways in Washington, if you don't send those F-16s and those weapons, then Egypt as a whole is going to drift away. Well, of course, it's the Brotherhood that's going to drift away. So what the Brotherhood are trying to do now is to sort of racketeering. They are telling us either you send us those weapons or we're going to move towards Iran and China. Good luck. If we had a different policy, we would have an alliance with civil society in Egypt, we'll reach out to the military, and with the combination of both, we can have a much better and balanced government in Egypt.
That's an excellent analysis of those issues. I just have one small question, and then we'll let you go. When you look at Gaza, being that we've had recent strife between Gaza and Israel, while Egypt has been dealing with the increased frustration of the people coming back to the streets in recent weeks and months, has Egypt been able to deal with the leadership in Gaza, and has there been any reduction in the flow of weapons? And last point, has the missiles or rockets being launched from Gaza in Israel trickled to almost a halt, or are they stopped altogether?
Again, a fabulous question. Let me try to summarize it as much as possible, because this is a PhD dissertation. It's a great question. Now, let me try to paint, from as much as I know and I can predict, from inside the war room of the Brotherhood, because that's what they have in Cairo, how they see Gaza. What is Gaza in the mind of Morsi and the Brotherhood? It's basically their Eastern Front with Israel. That's how they deal. They use it, number one, as we saw, to put pressure on the Israelis in the sense that they allowed those missiles and, some of these weapons to go to Gaza. Gaza was having a ceasefire with the Israelis, and suddenly they start shooting after Morsi came to power. But chapter 2, when the Gaza fire came into Israel, what happened worldwide? We rushed. Who can stop that fight? Washington rushed to Mr. Morsi. That's his plan. He wanted us actually to come and ask him, can you do something about Gaza? With pleasure, he answered. He went to the Gaza Hamas leadership and told them, okay, now you are at the table. You're not going to get the reaction by the Israelis. I can guarantee you that. But give me one thing. Give me a ceasefire. Meanwhile, during that ceasefire, I get more influence in Washington. I get my F-16 and whatever logistics I'm going to get. And you will get your weapons in time. So I am assuming that the Morsi strategy is to elevate Gaza as an international player, to limit Israel's reaction against Gaza by lobbying Washington that he is the peacemaker, and he got it. Had he not had this pushback by his own public opinion, Morsi today would be the kingmaker in Washington. He will be seen as the next major ally in the region. But his force, his credibility was undermined by the fact that his own people are rising against him. I'd be very nervous. I'd be very concerned about Morsi's strategy with regard to Gaza.
Now, again, excellent insight and answer there. Well, Dr. Walid Phares, I want to thank you so much for spending so much time with us today. It's been an absolute pleasure. And again, I have to plug your book because I have it. I've been reading it and enjoying it so much. It's The Coming Revolution, Struggle for Freedom in the Middle East. Dr. Walid Phares, again, thank you so much for joining us on The Final Say.
Thank you very much.